Добрый день, друзья. Скажите, мне видно, слышно?
Видно, слышно.
Хорошо. As far as I remember, we ended our last meeting with Joel's promise to give us a brief mini lecture on some point. Am I right, Joel?
Yes, but what I wanted to talk about is the next passage. So if you want to say something about the Transfiguration more, then let's do that first.
As for myself, I think I have said all that I could say. For me, our online seminar was important in this regard, that for the first time in my life I understood that Transfiguration and the Sermon on the Mountain are somehow two different reflections of the same thing, namely a reflection of Jesus' new Moses. But Transfiguration is Mark's version of this link, and Sermon on the Mountain is Matthew's version of this link.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes.
There was one thing, it's just a detail that I noticed this past week, and it's very peripherally related, but I've been working on Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7. And it's interesting that, I mean, I think probably this speech has been introduced into a pre-existing context. It's interesting that in Acts chapter 6, verse 15, we're told that those who were looking at Stephen as he's being accused, they saw his face like the face of an angel. And then at the conclusion of the story, he says, I see the heavens opened and Jesus sitting on the right hand of God. So I'll wait for your screen to share. Yeah, so 6:15, yeah. And then, so they saw his face like the face of an angel. And then in 7, at the end of the story in chapter 7, verse 55, he's looking up to heaven. Yeah, he's looking up to heaven and he sees Jesus sitting, standing. Yeah, you're right. Standing. That's interesting. Standing at the right hand of God. And he says in the next verse, I see the heavens opened. And the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. So possibly there was, there's a connection between his face shining like an angel and the heavens being opened, right? His face shines because the heavens are open and he sees the glory of God there. So a lot of people say that this whole long speech, which is kind of difficult to connect with the context, has been inserted here between 6, whatever that was, 6:15, and 7, the end of 7.
Мгм.
So I don't know, it kind of relates to the transfiguration where you see Jesus in glory and his clothes are shining, and in the other gospel, his face is shining. So, but it's a marginal connection, but I thought it was interesting. Has to do with visions of heavenly beings, light,
Мгм.
heavens being opened. There's a lot of motifs that are similar between the two parts of this story and the transfiguration story.
Yes, and the context is similar to some extent because, of course, in the Gospel of Mark, transfiguration is a prefiguration of Jesus' passion, of his sufferings.
Yeah, I think that, well, there is a connection, and he's just talked about his sufferings, you know, a few verses before the transfiguration.
Yes,
Uh,
and in
and
Stephen, yes, and in Stephen's case, his own passion follows immediately his vision.
yeah, and he's going to talk about suffering also after, in this next passage in 9, 11 to 13. And he also talks immediately after the passage in verses 9 and 10, I think, about the resurrection. So, we've been talking about the transfiguration as a foreshadowing of the resurrection. Immediately after the transfiguration, he's going to talk about his resurrection, and in this vision in Acts, Stephen sees the resurrected Jesus in glory. So there's a lot of common themes.
Yes, it's interesting. Thank you, Joel. Друзья, наши русскоязычные участники нашего семинара, скажите, у кого-нибудь еще по поводу сцены преображения есть какие-нибудь замечания или ремарки? Если нет, то тогда давайте мы переходим. Your comment, your mini lecture, Joel, is connected with our next passage. Am I right?
Yes. 9 to 13.
9 to 13, okay. Let me switch to 9 to 13. As far as I remember, we haven't read this pericope yet, either in Greek or in Russian.
Правильно.
Okay. Антон Гунарович, вы с нами?
Да.
Тогда давайте мы попросим вас.
Mikhail, you don't have the text on the screen. You still have the Acts passage.
Okay, I see. Now I changed the screens, yeah?
Да.
Да, теперь есть.
Yes, George, your comment will deal with the whole pericope, 9 through 13, or with some particular verses?
Well, yeah, more with the verses 11 to 13. So maybe we should talk about 9 and 10 first.
Okay, maybe we first just read these verses in Greek, then in Russian, and talk about more superficial things like translation of individual words, and then we'll ask you to give us a mini lecture on Elijah.
Good.
Хорошо?
Хорошо.
Антон Владимирович,
Да.
давайте стих за стихом прочтем с 9 по 13.
Хорошо. Κατά καμπάιν νόντων αυτών εκ του όρος διαστέλ. Αυτοίς γιναμεντενή γαίδων διέγεσονται. Με γοταν γοϊός του ανθρώπου εκ νεκρών αναστέ.
Да, когда они спускались с горы, Катабанан Нонтон, это у нас причастие настоящего времени, потому что как бы именно в процессе их спуска, да, Иисус велел им никому не рассказывать о том, что они видели, до тех пор, пока Сын Человеческий не воскреснет из мертвых. Конечно, может быть, буквально «эйме хотан» означало бы никому не рассказывать, кроме как в случае, если Сын Человеческий воскреснет из мертвых. Даже, может быть, с точки зрения вот буквального перевода греческая конструкция это было бы вернее, но кажется, что здесь совершенно очевидно текст подразумевает, что это случится, поэтому перевод «эйме хотан» как «до тех пор пока», мне кажется, не искажает греческий текст. A small item on which I dwelt in discussing my Russian translation was that literally «эйме хотан» is a condition which by itself does not imply that this condition may be realized.
No.
The disciples shouldn't tell anyone except the case if the Son of Man returns from the realm of the dead. But I think that the context is so clear that in Jesus' vision, this will happen, that we can follow the model that is assumed by most translations and just translate that they shouldn't tell anyone about this until the Son of Man returns to life from the realm of the dead.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to me it would be more ambiguous if it was eime ean rather than eime hotan. But clearly, for the readers, they know,
Yes.
Jesus has been raised from the dead. So I agree with your translation.
So that even if grammatically the construction is conditional, it's clear that in the context it's not a conditional thing. It's something, unconditional.
Yeah, and I think in Koine Greek, the sort of classical analyses of conditions don't always hold.
Yes, but here I think the contextual factor may be even more important than the difference between Koine and classical Greek. Давайте тогда прочтем 10 стих.
Kai ton logon ekratesen pros eotus, hyudzatuntes, tiestin to ek nekron anastene.
Мгм. Они запомнили эти слова, ну, как бы, да, схватили за них, ну, и стали спрашивать друг у друга, что значит воскреснуть из мертвых. Мы немножко говорили насчет в прошлый раз, насчет этого тон логан экратосен, и в качестве какой-то, может быть, не самой близкой параллели приводили место соответствующее из Евангелия от Луки, где говорится, что то, что происходило, и то, что говорили гости Марии при Рождестве Иисуса, Мария складывала в сердце своем. Ну, может быть, образ действительно запоминания, удерживания чего-то схож, но слова разные. Запомнили.
Now, I should say that, these two verses, especially verse 9, are key for William Vreda's analysis of the messianic secret. That he thinks this shows that the messianic secret, it points to, a time when it will no longer be a secret, and that is namely after Jesus is raised from the dead. So that it's a theological construction which contextually it's somewhat artificial. I mean, like in verse 10, for example, the disciples don't know what raising from the dead means. How can they not know that? Haven't they read Daniel? And Jesus himself has talked about his resurrection already at the end of chapter 8. So there, if you try to like make sense of this in a narrative way, sometimes you have problems, and maybe those problems point to a theology and ideology superseding the narrative needs of the passage, mainly that Mark wants to point to the post-resurrectional period as the period at which the secret will be revealed.
Yes. As concerns the translation, Caeton logon ekratasen pros hetus sudzetundes. У нас как бы здесь эти два действия друг с другом связаны. Не то, что они отдельно запоминают, отдельно спрашивают друг у друга, а то, что они спрашивают друг у друга. They ask each other, they discuss these words because they pay attention to these words. Ekratasen maybe not so much as that they remembered it for eternity, that they heeded to these words and immediately started discussing. This is relevant for our translation. Russian запомнили is more oriented towards future, not towards what is going here and now.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of passages in Mark, it can be taken on two levels. It makes some sense in the immediate context, but also, Mark thinks that Christians should meditate on the words of Jesus and discover new meanings in them.
Okay. Do we see now different English translations? New Jerusalem Bible, they observed the warning faithfully. King James Version, they kept the same with themselves. Синодальный перевод, они удержали это слово. More or less literal translation of Greek ekratesa. Но, как вы видите, я предпочел дать более идиоматическое, они запомнили. Коллеги, прежде всего, русскоязычные коллеги, вы такую стратегию, тактику поддерживаете? Что скажете?
Да, вполне ясно, это придает значение Кратису.
Но мне кажется, что без объяснения это выглядит несколько как-то негладко. Действительно, запомнили, это дает перспективу в будущее, а стали спрашивать, это то, что немедленно происходит. Но с учетом того, что вот сейчас было сказано о такой двойной перспективе, это может быть вот как раз уместно.
Окей. Спасибо за поддержку. Тогда переходим к 11 стиху.
Kai eperoton auton legontes, hoti legusin, hoi grammateis, hoti elien dei eltein proton.
Да. И они стали спрашивать у Иисуса. Здесь имперфект, эперотон, мне кажется, имеет смысл понимать как имперфектум деконатум. И тем самым, видите, как они стали спрашивать у Иисуса. Но ведь по-русски даже, впрочем, не так уж серьезная разница между они спрашивали, не стали спрашивать, но как будет вот так вот, стали спрашивать у Иисуса. Буквально, по-видимому, Готи здесь вводит прямую речь. То есть книжники или, как перевод слово грамматеи, толкователи Писания говорят, что сперва должен прийти Илия. Ну, как мы видим в издании, которое, конечно же, не основывается на рукописях начала нашей эры, здесь стоит вопросительный знак, но он походит, но и по сути дела напрашивается здесь, только к чему он относится. Явно, что речь идет не про то, что говорят ли толкователи Писания, что сперва Илья должен прийти или нет. Скорее, вопросы связаны с тем, а как нам быть с тем, что толкователи Писания говорят, что Илья должен прийти первым. Но вот это пытался передать, введя слово «ведь». Ведь толкователи Писания говорят, что сперва должен прийти Илья. Тогда мы тоже можем по-русски поставить знак вопроса. In Greek, it's a kind of ellipsis, because what is the essence of this question? We have question mark, at least in our edited Greek text. And obviously the question is related not to whether the scribes say Hauti and they obtain proton or not, but rather what about the implications of what they say. So,
Yeah.
so the kind of ellipsis here.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's a lot of ellipses in this passage.
Okay, then verse 12. 12 стих.
Rode Efe autois, Elias men elton proton, apo kathistanei panta, kai pos gegraptai epiton iuion tu anthropu, hina pola pathe, kai exudenethe.
Да, он сказал им, Илья, придя первым, все установит. Я дальше поставил многоточие. А почему Писание говорит о Сыне Человеческом, что ему предстоит много страданий и унижений? То, что у нас греческий текст слов Иисуса начинается Ильяс мен, по-видимому, это мен – это такое воспоминание о том, что в классическом греческом языке, тогда, когда нужно было противопоставить друг другу суждения А и Б, то стандартным было для этого представление man de. The particle man here probably indicates that some contrast is intended.
Yeah, it's very rare in Mark. I'm not sure if he uses men anywhere else. But yeah, and I mean in classical Greek, the men needs to be followed by a de, generally. But I would say in this case, the men correlates with the Allah at the beginning of verse 13.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. What is the second part of the contrast implied by man?
Right.
It may be either man Allah or man and Kai in the next line.
Yes.
On the one hand, Elijah having come brings everything back to order.
Mm-hmm.
And what's on the other hand?
Yeah.
And grammatically, there are two possibilities. One that, on the other hand, is the second part of verse 12.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, how can it be that in this context of Elijah's mission, that we all know that according to the scriptures, Gegraptai, the Son of Man must suffer, question mark. I would rather, maybe I'm wrong, understand this contrast to be within verse 12, between the first and second part. On the one hand, we all know something about Elijah, but on the other hand, how can we reconcile it, this knowledge, with what we know about the Son of Man? And then verse 13 gives a resolution to this contrast, resolution to this apparent contradiction.
Yes. Okay. I think you may be right about the grammar there. So my radical suggestion is that verse 12, Hoda Ephea autois, and then what follows, Elias men elthon proton apokathistane panta, that should be read as a question. And this
So in your suggestion, we have two independent questions. in verse 12. One question is it really that Elijah should come first and restore everything? Question mark. Then second question, how can it be that it is written about the Son of Man that he must suffer?
Yeah,
So Jesus starts with two questions. If I am right in how I understand you.
yes, and the way I translate though is it really true that Elijah, when he comes, will restore everything? And
Mhm.
how can it be then that the scripture has said that the Son of Man must suffer? In other words, if Elijah, does the whole bit, if Elijah restores everything, what need is there for Jesus' suffering and death, which he's already prophesied? So it is, as you say, there are two apparently contradictory expectations that are spoken of within verse 12. On the one hand, the expectation, which you do get from the scripture, from the end of Malachi, that Elijah is going to come and restore the hearts of the children to the fathers and vice versa. He'll restore everything. But on the other hand, you also get, at least according to Mark, the expectation from the scripture that the Son of Man will suffer many things and be rejected. And then he reconciles it in verse 13. How do you reconcile the expectation of Elijah coming first with the idea of the suffering of the Son of Man? Well, Elijah has come first. He has gone before Jesus in the way of suffering and death. So you need a suffering Elijah if you're going to have a suffering Son of Man. So I see this as an attempt to reconcile apparently contradictory expectations derived from the scriptures. And, this isn't the only place where Mark does this. He also does it in chapter 12 with the question about the Son of David.
Excuse me, what happens in chapter 12?
In chapter 12, verses 35 to 37, you have another example of apparently contradictory scriptures being reconciled with each other. On the one hand, the scriptural expectation that the Messiah is to be the Son of David, and on the other hand, Psalm 110.
Yes,
Lord, yeah.
yes. I brought these verses to the screen. Do you see them now?
Yeah, I see 1235. Yeah.
Okay.
And there also it's, what the scribes say. The scribes' interpretation is being disputed.
Yeah, but here in verses 35 through 37, Jesus does not give an explicit solution to the contradiction.
True.
He just points to the contradiction, and then it is left to the readers of Mark's gospel to make the conclusion themselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think maybe Matthew makes it more explicit than Mark, but we can talk about that when we come to it.
Okay.
But it's also, scripture against scripture. And I was inspired, to write this article on scriptural contradictions in Mark by an article by Niels Dahl about scriptural contradictions in Paul. And he points out that, you know, Scripture is full of contradictions, and ancient Jewish exegetes were well aware of that. And you can see them, especially in rabbinic texts, explicitly trying to work with scriptural contradictions and iron them out and reconcile them somehow. And I think what I say in the article is that usually they did that by identifying one of the scriptural expectations as the leading voice, subordinating the other one to that, and then showing you can affirm both of them, but you have to read the second in terms of the first. And I think that's what's going on in both of these passages.
You mentioned your article contradictions in contradictory scriptures as they are interpreted in Mark. Have you published this article?
Yeah. So it was originally in ZNW, and then it became a chapter in my book on Mark's Old Testament exegesis. But I can send you the article.
Thank you very much. If you can send it just to everyone, or you can send it to me, I'll share it with other participants of the seminar. Okay?
Whatever, yeah, I can hit reply all to the emailer.
Yes.
But-
So in any case, we have a contradiction here, a contradiction between two different statements, both of which are purported to be based on the Old Testament prophecies. One statement is that Elijah will come and bring everything in order, and he will come first.
Right, you need to go back to your to the Mark text. You still have the
Okay. Yes.
you still have 1235 up. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's one statement. The second statement is that the Son of Man, who is to come after Elijah, because we are explicitly told that Elijah, Elton Proton, will come before the Son of Man. If Elijah is to bring everything in order, how can it be that after everything has already been brought to order, the Son of Man will suffer?
Yeah.
These are two statements that are both purported to be based on the Old Testament prophecies, which obviously contradict each other. You suggest that we read both of these statements as questions. In my translation, I do not remember where did I get this exegesis, but surely I think it was not invented by me. I rather see the first of these statements as a kind of quotation, just quotes the popular opinion that Elijah will come first and bring everything in order. At some point, I even thought about putting these verses within quotes to bring this even more to the fore. And then, having quoted this popular opinion, he gives the second statement, which contradicts the first one and is put as a question. Why, if the first statement is right, the Son of Man, having come after this, should suffer? And then in verse 13, we have the resolution. I don't know which solution is closer to what was there in Mark's mind when he wrote this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a puzzling passage, and it's hard to figure out the line of thought. And I thought that my suggestion of reading this part of verse 12 as a question made more sense of the line of thought. But so the way that I'm construing it is that Jesus is affirming the first part of this statement about Elijah. Yes, Elijah does come first, but is it really true that he restores everything? Because if Elijah restores everything, what is there left for the Messiah to do? Is, what I'm supplying as the problem. So what he's really questioning is apokathistane panta, which is, a conclusion that you could derive from the scripture, from the Malachi text. He'll restore the hearts of the fathers to the sons and so on. But I think he's saying it's not necessarily a right conclusion from the text, that what you should draw from Malachi is just the expectation that Elijah comes first. But he comes first in a way of suffering and death. He doesn't restore, Elijah doesn't restore everything. That's the job of the Son of Man. But Elijah is, or John the Baptist, is Jesus' forerunner. He goes before Jesus in the way of suffering and death. So I realize I'm importing a lot in order to make sense of the passage, but the passage as it stands, if you don't read that part of verse 12 as a question, I think is very difficult to understand otherwise. So that's my suggestion, and nobody has followed me in this, and so I may be wrong about it, but what I do think is that this passage is a very difficult passage, and I do think that elsewhere we can see Mark using this technique of trying to reconcile contradictory scriptures. So I don't know, that's my suggestion.
Well, I think his suggestion is very convincing. And in fact, it's not too different from the interpretation of this passage that I originally had in mind. I would rather choosing between putting Илья, придя первым, все восстановит into quotation marks, or following it with a question mark, or probably follow your suggestion to put a question mark here, because this question mark also implies that Jesus is quoting some popular belief.
Yeah, I think you could put both the quotation marks and the question mark, and because, yeah, I agree with you. He's referring to what the scribes say, which is after all what the disciples have asked him about.
But one interesting thing that I saw when looking at different versions and editions. Wait a second. I have in my Bible version both the critical edition of the Greek text, which is the last edition for the Bible Societies, which responds to the last Nestle-Aland edition, and on the other hand, the edition of the so-called Byzantine text. It's interesting that the differences are not important. How the Efe autois versus how the apocryphase apen autois. The remaining verse are not important. It seems that the Byzantine text here uses the classical form apokatesta, while the critical edition following the early manuscripts keeps the Koine form apokatestani, panta, kaipos gegraptai, iton hion, trantropo hina, hola, mata kai, xidinote. The most important difference is in punctuation, because the Byzantine text ends with a full stop, the period, and since the Byzantine manuscripts already have signs of punctuation, I think that this period is borrowed from real manuscripts. The critical edition puts quotation mark at the end of this verse. I think probably this quotation mark is put here not because the early Unschel texts have quotation mark here. They do not have quotation marks. But it's a decision of Nestle-Aland or whoever was responsible for editing this verse. But it seems that the one who edited this text for the critical edition was already following more or less the same type of exegesis as we develop now. Understanding this as a quotation of things that mutually undermine each other and should be reconciled somehow.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, I try not to pay attention to the punctuation in edited texts, because punctuation came in at a later point, and it may be wrong.
But here the punctuation, of course, it's secondary. It's introduced by a 20th century editor, but it's an important exegetical device by which the 20th century editors pointed at the interpretation of this text. Русскоязычные друзья и коллеги, скажите, вам понятен глубокий смысл вопросительного знака в конце этого стиха? Вот. То, про что мы сейчас говорили с Джоэлем. Нужно ли делать какое-то русское резюме для этого?
Сделайте, пожалуйста.
Ну, тогда я попробую сделать русское резюме, прежде всего посмотрев на синодальный перевод. Да? Согласно синодальному переводу, Иисус говорит: правда, или я должен прежде прийти и устроить все. Это утвердительное предложение. Дальше утвердительное предложение. И сыну человеческому, как написано о нем, надлежит много пострадать и быть уничиженным.
And I guess what I'm questioning is this word pravda there. And the word indeed in the New Jerusalem Bible, and the word verily in the King James. Because
Yes, exactly, because neither of these words can legitimately be understood as a translation of the Greek man. I would rather say that the implications of verily, indeed, or pravda are just the opposite to what Greek man implies here, because Greek man implies some contradiction, while pravda, indeed, and verily, that everything is okay, no contradiction, no problem with understanding the Old Testament. Мы видим, что русский синодальный перевод, а также King James Version с этим совпадает. Они действительно опираются на византийский текст, и, видимо, в данном случае повлиял также и на текст Receptus, потому что в King James Version у нас тоже нет никаких вопросов, а только точка. В то время как в переводах более новых, вот видим, например, New Revised Standard Version, кончается вопросительным.
What is действительно in the CRV? What does that mean?
Verily.
Oh, okay.
New Revised Standard Version, New Jerusalem Bible. Put question mark at the end. One question mark. And what Joel suggests is putting two question marks in this verse. So, in some sense, we can say that в каком-то смысле можно сказать, что издатели критического текста греческого, видите, у нас здесь издатели критического греческого текста поставили в конце греческого текста вопросительный знак, в отличие от византийских манускриптов. Что издатели критического текста, а также последовавшие за ним переводчики New Jerusalem Bible, это важнейший католический англоязычный перевод 20 века, а также New Revised Standard Version, важнейший перевод наиболее принятый в современной академической англоязычной науке, сделали шаг навстречу той интерпретации, предлагает Джоэль. Или, может быть, полшага, поскольку полный шаг был бы, если бы они поставили два вопросительных знака, как то, что мы сейчас сделали в нашем переводе. Сейчас мы смотрим на Bible-Works, правильно? Или мы смотрим на нашу русскую диглотту, русско-греческую?
Bible-Works.
Bible-Works. Хорошо, спасибо. Тогда можем вернуться к нашей диглотте.
I'm not the first one that suggested that this was a question. Wellhausen, who wrote a very thin commentary on Mark at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, he suggested it was a question. So.
Ага. Julius Wellhausen.
Yes. He
Okay.
wrote on a lot of things. He wrote about the Quran also, and also, of course, biblical sources in the Pentateuch. So.
Yes, I like his figure. It's just it's really a genius who worked in many areas and everywhere left important traces.
Yes, and I think he eventually resigned from the theological faculty because he said he realized that he was making his students unfit to be pastors. There's
Yes.
a letter that he wrote in which he says this.
Yeah, I remember this. Some time ago, I wrote a paper for a Russian theological journal on the problem of biblical scholarship and theology, and there I quoted this letter of Wellhausen as a witness to how it was in the 19th century, followed by a question that I was asking whether the same problem is inevitable for Christianity in the 21st century.
Yeah, I thought about this letter often when I was trying to teach theological students.
Yes, it's an important question.
Because they often felt that I was making them unfit to be pastors by raising all sorts of questions, exegetical questions, historical questions.
Yes, in the paper for the theology, John, that I just quoted, I also speculated about these topics and then came to the conclusion that the problems that Christianity for 21st century is to deal with are not in this area, but rather in the area of how can we reconcile some church teachings with the existential choices people have to make in their real life in our time. And I concluded that, in fact, the biblical criticism aimed at the church doctrine is, in fact, beneficial for Christian faith of 21st century because it helps to be more critical towards the tradition.
I'd like to see that.
Okay, I can send it to you, and you can use it as your textbook for Russian
Spasibo.
in your Russian studies. Okay.
Good. Anyway, I do think Wellhausen was some sort of genius.
Yes, and in fact, this is what I always tell my students when I teach the Old Testament, that it's really amazing that now, from the point of view of the Old Testament scholarship of the end of the 20th century, the beginning of 21st century, most of the Old Testament scholarship of the 20th century seems to be outdated. But Wellhausen from the 19th century, to me at least, does not look outdated.
Yeah,
It's-
I agree with you. I mean,
it's
I
really-
do think, yeah, he was somewhat anti-Jewish, right? And he had this construction of Second Temple Judaism as degenerate, degeneration from the biblical revelation, and so, you know, I mean, people often say bad things about him, and I think in that area, you know, there is something to be criticized. But I don't think his exegetical and you know, source critical work, you know, should for that reason be ignored.
Yes, definitely. But I didn't know that he also made such fun remarks on the Gospel of Mark. If you can give me a reference to Wellhausen's work
Yeah,
where he suggests this question mark, I would be grateful.
yeah.
Thank-
It's a very thin little commentary, and I think he may have done it on all of the Gospels. I'm not sure, but I'll send you the reference.
Thank you. But in any case, you see that there's an exegetical tradition that puts no question marks in version 12, which is witnessed to by Byzantine manuscripts, as well as Textus Receptus. And the translations are made from Textus Receptus, like Russian Synodal version, a King James version. Then there is a critical edition, which puts here one quotation mark at the end of verse 12.
One
Probably
question
follow-
mark.
Sorry?
One question mark.
One question mark, yes. Probably following the suggestion by Wellhausen, and followed in turn by most New Testament translations of the last 100 of years. And then there's your suggestion of two quotation marks, which is the next in the line. And our new Russian translation that we're working on, which is probably the first one to incorporate two quotation marks theory into the text of the translation.
It's a pioneering translation, your translation.
Thank you.
You are in the vanguard. I didn't convince any English translator to translate it that way, but Russia leads the way.
Yeah, but I do not remember now where did I get the idea that the first half of verse 12 is a quotation from a common opinion, but it was not you. But this was not too far from what you suggest.
No, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
You
Let's-
just have a good exegetical instinct.
Yes. Let's read verse 13, and then we can turn to the pericope as such from the beginning to the end. Антон Гунович, прочтете нам 13 стих?
Да. Аля лего гемин хоти кай Elias eleluthen kai epoiasen auto rosa ethelon kakos gegraptai epauton.
Да, я говорю вам, Илья уже пришел, один из редких случаев, где у нас перфект в греческом языке. Его здесь хорошо как раз передать классическим способом передачи греческого перфекта, как русский, как уже плюс русское прошедшее. Но люди сделали с ним, что хотели, как и было о нем предсказано в Писании. Но буквально как и было о нем написано, вот, но там, где у нас встречается в греческом языке вот эти слова геграптай, точно так же, как грамматейс, графе и прочее, здесь явно имеется в виду отсылка к Писанию. Мне кажется, что если мы вместо более непонятного для современного человека, как написано о нем, напишем, как и было о нем предсказано в Писании, мы ничего не повредим в изначальном тексте, только сделаем чуть-чуть более ясным ту информацию, которая так в нем была эксплицитной. Здесь, конечно, у нас есть еще слово «Аллах», вот, которое в свете того, про что мы сейчас с Джоэлем говорили, несет определенный смысл. То есть вначале, вот как Джоэль предлагает, с двумя вопросительными знаками у нас цитируются два общепринятых мнения насчет того, что должно произойти в конце времен. Получается у нас некоторое противоречие, но оно разрешается. Но чтобы его разрешить, разрешает противоречие, я говорю вам, что Илья пришел, но с ним люди делали, что хотели.
So you chose not to put like a no or a there before я говорю вам?
Yes, that's what I'm now discussing in Russian. The logic is understandable, but Russian no, no other variants of rendering this Allah into Russian, as I see, wouldn't stylistically fit here.
And how about instead of no? Because I mean, I guess what I see verse 13 doing is it's sort of qualifying and reconciling all of these scriptural expectations that were, said, were spoken of in verses 11 and 12. And it's, sort of turning it in a different direction, but maybe not as, but it's not contradicting them, it's reconciling. So, I mean, I take it that is less contrastive than no. I guess you have used above though in verse 12, so maybe you don't want to do it again.
Окей. Русскоязычные участники нашей дискуссии. Есть ли у нас какой-то способ передать греческое «Аллах» в начале 13 стиха без насилия над русской стилистикой? Правильно я понимаю, что молчание означает скорее отсутствие предложений. Но давайте тогда оставим Аллах без перевода. In our short discussion in Russian, we decided to leave Allah untranslated,
Okay.
just because of Russian stylistics.
Yeah. I thought I liked your translation of no ljudi сделали с ним, because your apoiesin there is an impersonal, they did it to him. And it sometimes, it seems to take the place of a passive sometimes. I think Aramaic doesn't have a passive, so this is sometimes identified as an Aramaic type trait. The usage of the impersonal third person plural instead of a passive.
But we also encounter this such impersonal constructions in Hebrew as well.
Yeah.
And though Aramaic does not have anything like Hebrew, nif'al, there are also some reflexive and passive construction possible in Aramaic.
Anyway, when people are talking about Semitic structures in Mark, they sometimes identify this impersonal third person plural as a Semitic trait.
Yes, it may be right. I just wonder whether we should link it specifically to Aramaic or to Aramaic and Hebrew as well, because in Hebrew such constructions are also quite often and regular.
Yeah. I mean, in colloquial English as well, maybe in Russian too, you can also do it. They did this to him. And, not specifying who the they is, but it's a undefined, I think the implication is what you say. Люди сделали с ним.
Вот не поступило в чат предложение, можно сказать, а я говорю вам, чтобы была перекличка с Нагорной проповедью. Он сказал им, Илья, придя первым, все восстановит. А почему Писание говорит о Сыне Человеческом, что ему стоит много страданий и уничижений? А я говорю вам, Илья уже пришел. Вот в русском не работает такая цепочка из двух «а» идущих одно с другой. И даже если мы берем первый «а», все равно так оно не получится. Он сказал им, Илья, придя первым, все восстановит. Почему же Писание говорит о Сыне Человеческом, а я говорю вам? Такое ощущение, что здесь вот при таком логическом построении текста по-русски действительно нулевой маркер работает лучше, чем эксплицитный маркер А. Okay, we read these verses.
Can I make one more point before we stop?
Okay.
And that is, I think it's interesting, you know, if we were right to say that this passage is about reconciling scriptural contradictions, it's interesting at the end, he says, kathos gegraptai epauton, for what is really, I think, not a scriptural expectation, but this way of reconciling the two scriptures. But he is saying that that itself is scripture, scriptural. And I do, I think you can find instances in Second Temple and later Jewish texts where they do something similar. They ascribe scriptural authority to something that is really an exegetical conclusion. And that, that in itself is hermeneutically significant. Saying that your own exegetical conclusions, you're using the scripture, but you're coming up with something new, though you don't recognize it's new. You say it's all in the scripture.
Yes, but the same thing is true with regard to the previous statement about the Son of Man, because the scripture, at least general, says something about Son of Man, and one can legitimately say that the scripture prophesied something about the Son of Man, but not about not that polepate kai exodinate.
Yeah.
This is.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. That is also a scriptural conclusion. So the line between scriptural conclusion and scripture itself is blurred. Maybe it was always blurred, in Israelite and later Jewish understanding.
Yes, but at least the statement that Elias men elton proton apokatastane panta, this can be grounded in the text of Malachi without serious reinterpretations.
Yeah, that's right. So it's interesting. The scriptural expectation that is easier to find in a biblical text, he's qualifying. And in my interpretation, if we take this as a question, whereas the one that he is affirming and that is the center of the whole passage is one that is, much more difficult to derive from the scripture, because as you say, Son of Man is basically a glorious figure, not a suffering figure. In especially in the most important passage, which is Daniel 7. So I think it does say something about the flexibility of of Mark's understanding, let's say, of what exactly hagraphe is.
Yes, and I think that the discussion here is also related to one question that we haven't maybe paid enough attention to. We read in verse 10, the disciples are discussing what is the meaning of the resurrection. it would have been quite logical for them if they are discussing this thing and they wanted to address a question to Jesus, to ask Jesus, τι εστίν το εκ νεκρών αναστέναι. But
Yeah.
instead of this, they ask Jesus a different question. But obviously, since on the one hand, the desires to know τι εστίν το εκ νεκρών αναστέναι, and on the other hand, they ask Jesus a question about Elijah, these two topics are somehow related.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it does remind me of what, psychiatrists and therapists say, sometimes what sometimes the real problem is determining what the real question is. And here they don't ask what the real question is, but they ask another question, which is somehow related. I think psychologically also it's interesting.
Okay, but can we reconstruct any kind of logic behind this? Because if these two things, the question that they ask each other, the question that they put to Jesus, if these two questions are related to each other, then what is the logic? How are they related to each other?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think maybe you could say, so if they're thinking not just about resurrection in general, but also about Jesus' resurrection and what he's said before about, back in 831 or something, about how he has to suffer and die before he's resurrected, then I guess you could say that their question is refers to that whole prophecy, not only of the resurrection, but also of his suffering. But if he's going to suffer, what about Elijah? Because Elijah is supposed to come first. So, but I'm not sure that's a good answer. Give me another week to think about it.
Okay. We have already approached the end of our today's time. So okay, let's agree that we give you a week to think about this. By the way, I looked in your commentary to find an answer to my question that I just posed.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't, I haven't found an answer that would convince me. So probably we can think, and after a week, you can give us an answer that will be in addition to what you have said in your commentary.
Может быть.
Okay. In any case, we are eager to hear you in a week's time, next Thursday.
Спасибо. До свидания.
Спасибо. До свидания всем.
До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания.